Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another webinar about our favorite topic, the winery general order. I feel like I'm talking into the mirror right now, so I can't see everybody's beautiful faces while I have the presentation up, but I'm glad to see all of the participants. To get things started, I can go through my presentation. There we go. Okay, first I want to introduce Summit's team. There are little blips on the participants, but I'll introduce them by name. We have Joshua Martinez. He'll be our tech support during today's presentation. Jason Flowers will be helping with Q&A. And then we have Julian Kane, a newer addition to the Summit wastewater team, and he will be helping answer any questions and provide technical support as needed. Everybody should be muted. We did that intentionally so there's not, disruptive noise. And then once we get to the Q&A session, we will ask you to raise your hand if you have a question, and we can unmute you to ask your question. Or if you would prefer just to enter a question into the Zoom chat function, you can do that. You can email Jason directly, whatever is easiest for you to get your question across if you haven't already emailed that to us. And then as follow-up, you can contact any one of us. I put my email on here just in case you need it, but feel free to reach out after the presentation. And just to let everybody know, this presentation is being recorded. We will send it out to everybody that has attended, in addition to some people that were not able to attend today. So I know some of you attended the first webinar that we had a year ago, over a year ago. And so I'll provide a little bit of background information into the content of the general order, and then trying to focus on what do you need to do? When do you need to do it by? How much is it going to cost? And then followed by a Q&A session, because there are a lot of specific questions that facilities have that are specific to your situation. This is a kind of blanket list of acronyms that we may be referring to throughout the presentation. No need to memorize this. There won't be a quiz, but we like to use acronyms quite a bit in the engineering world. And in this regard, they're specifically related to water, wastewater. Typically, if you have a question at any point about what that acronym means, please ask or put it in the chat function and we will define that for you. Otherwise, I will breeze right through them and use acronyms as much as possible. So to start, one of the biggest things with understanding the impacts of this general order is knowing where you fall within the tier structure that the state has defined. So facilities need to have a good understanding of what their annual wastewater production volume is, whether that's calculated based on production volume, whether it's measured with flow meters. Somehow we need to define what that annual PW generation is or is going to be in the near future. So the state has broken up the tiers into 4 different tiers with the addition of an exempt category. So if you produce less than 10,000 gallons of processed wastewater each year, you're exempt, do not need to enroll in the general order. And then depending on if you're tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, will define what your compliance might look like, what your monitoring and reporting will look like. So we need to get a good handle on what category you'd fall into. Keeping in mind that your processed wastewater volume also needs to include stormwater collected and sent to the wastewater system. The state wants to look at that cumulative volume of wastewater and stormwater. If you don't have flow measurement for all of the wastewater going to your pond or your subsurface system or to land application, we will need to understand where you're collecting stormwater so that we can estimate those volumes and help classify which tier you're in. Some facilities may find that the stormwater is pushing them into a higher tier than they want to be, so we can help you look at, should we put a canopy over this area? Should we do something to reduce that stormwater contribution to get us out of the requirements for a higher tier? And just kind of emphasizing here that the state is only interested in the wastewater volume, right? But we've added columns on this slide to show the correlation to wine production and cases of wine, because most winery facilities talk in terms of wine production and or cases of wine. So next time, the next few slides, I'll talk about the typical type of wastewater systems that are regulated by this general order. So many facilities have existing ponds. I don't see as many new ponds going in, but they are still a feasible treatment option. So for pond systems, the state is looking for us to determine the pond capacity and show what the capacity is by means of a water balance. So they want us to look at wastewater generated, evaporation out of the pond, precipitation into the pond, and just the overall wastewater water balance to determine if your pond has the capacity to accommodate a 24-hour 100-year storm and can handle the wastewater influent into that pond. For existing ponds, the state will allow tier 1 and tier 2 facilities to maintain their ponds as is. If you fall into tier 3 or 4, you'll need to demonstrate that your liner meets permeability specs. If your pond was installed less than 10 years ago, you could provide construction drawings, geotechnical information to demonstrate that you meet that requirement. Otherwise, they'll require a performance test if your ponds are older than that. So you'll have to do geotechnical boring testings if you have a clay liner or perhaps a concrete liner. Synthetic liners, if you have a synthetic liner that's greater than 10 years old, you'll need to show that you aren't, the liner is not leaking. For new ponds, similarly, you'll need to demonstrate you meet that storm capacity, the 24-hour 100-year storm, and you'll need to show that you're meeting the liner requirement with clay, concrete, or a synthetic liner. Another kind of new requirement that's different from many local jurisdictions for ponds is you'll need to demonstrate you're providing a 5-foot separation to groundwater, unless you're able to show that by providing 2 feet, you will not degrade groundwater quality. Those will be approved on a case-by-case basis based on what we're able to present to the state. So from a pond or from a package system, or possibly for some facilities, you may go straight to land application. So land application areas are regulated by the general order, and the state does not have any specific hydraulic limits. They just ask for good irrigation practices. That's kind of an ambiguous term, but in our technical report, we'll need to demonstrate what the irrigation practice or cycle is for your land application area. You know, what's your total acreage? How is it split up? How many days will it take to cycle through irrigation of your entire land application area? What the state is looking for is that you're meeting the BOD loading criteria and that irrigation cycle average limit is no more than 100 pounds per acre per day. One of the interesting things with the requirements of this order is that in a lot of cases, if you have the land area, you can irrigate raw winery influent on land if you're spreading it out over a large enough area. However, you need to demonstrate that it's not ponding or running off, it's not creating nuisances. And in many cases, that water or wastewater is used for irrigation of vineyard. And so while it may be allowed by the state, it's not necessarily best practice from a vineyard irrigation and health standpoint. But we'll need to demonstrate that the BOD effluent limits will meet that 100 pounds per acre per day. The state will also be looking at nitrogen loading limits through a nutrient balance that's provided in the technical report. And I'll get into what the implications are if you're not, meeting nitrogen requirements later on. Another kind of change to current practices, there is a reduction in setback requirements under this new general order. You only need to provide a 50-foot setback from a land application area to a water supply well or a drainage course and 25 feet to the property line. Unless you can show that you can prevent offsite discharges or runoff, then you can meet a 5-foot property line setback. The other alternative treatment system to a pond land application area is a subsurface disposal area. And this is meant to encompass any sort of subsurface leach field type disposal system. So the state has applied a all-encompassing 1 gallon per square foot per day loading rate. Now, in most jurisdictions, there is site and soil specific criteria that you need to look at through soils evaluations, perk testing, what have you, that you will assign a loading rate based on that soil type and structure. However, the state is allowing a global hydraulic loading limit. While it's allowed, my recommendation would be to look at the local requirements or have us look at the local requirements and to make sure your system's sized for that. Otherwise, I think there could be the potential for surfacing and a failure of the system. So I think it's a good idea to do that comparison and due diligence so that whatever system you have will, there will be some longevity to it. Additionally, for subsurface systems, effluent limits prior to discharge, there's water quality requirements for tiers 2, 3, and 4. BOD needs to be less than 300 milligrams per liter, total nitrogen less than 10, total suspended solids less than 330. And unless you're able to demonstrate that what you're disposing of in your subsurface system meets those requirements, pre-treatment will be required. So I would say 99.99% of the facilities we work with, pre-treatment would be required because they're not meeting those that water quality criteria. And in many cases, if you're going through the expense and effort to put in a pre-treatment system, putting it in subsurface might not make the most sense. You have more flexibility for using it above ground. And so I think it would be worth looking at a surface application post pre-treatment versus subsurface disposal. So that's something we could talk about with each facility. Additionally, groundwater separation. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're providing 5 feet of groundwater separation to the bottom of your trench, from the bottom of your trench to the shallowest groundwater level, or 2 feet if approved on a case-by-case basis. Most jurisdictions, local jurisdictions require, at least Napa and Sonoma require 2 to 3 feet, depending. So providing 5 feet is going to be a stretch in many cases. So we'll want to take a close look at that. 100% reserve area, just in case there's system failure. They want to know you have a backup area. Again, this is slightly reduced because in a lot of jurisdictions, they require 200%. And then on a case-by-case basis, the state has been pretty ambiguous about if they'll allow dry wells, mounds, ETI beds. In most cases, I don't know that they will be able to approve them. They've said that if you can demonstrate that you're not degrading groundwater quality, they may be allowed, but in a lot of cases, dry wells are fairly deep, and ETI beds are pretty antiquated and undersized. So at first glance, I would say most of those systems are not going to be allowed under this new general order. And then the state has specific rules around maintaining a commingled system, meaning you're combining your domestic waste with your process waste. It's combining and going into a subsurface system. For existing facilities that have that type of a system, they will allow you to continue with commingling, but you will need to pre-treat your process waste. And in some cases, you may want to segregate the subsurface disposal system to have a dedicated area for process waste and a dedicated area for domestic waste. But regardless, the pre-treatment piece will likely be required. What do you need to do? So there's a series of things that we would recommend you do to prepare for enrollment. So the first thing we'd recommend is collecting wastewater generation and water quality data. So you can do that by means of installing flow meters. We can help you determine where you should put in a flow meter so that you can better track your wastewater generation rather than have it be based on estimates, because every facility has different processes and water use goals, or just people operate their facilities differently. And so having data that demonstrates what your actual usage is going to be the most useful for determining what you need to do to comply and which tier you'll fall into. Similarly, collecting water quality data up front to know what the implications are is a recommendation of ours. It's not a requirement by the state, but that way you can go into enrollment with your eyes wide open about what this looks like for your facility. And I'll go over some more details in another slide. Tier determination, like I mentioned previously, it's tied to your production, not your entitlement. So if you are producing half of what your entitlement allows, you will only need to demonstrate your wastewater generation tied to your current production. The next step, aside from collecting data, is to assess the capacity and compliance of your pond, your LAA, or your SDS. And we can help with that, looking at the data, looking at existing drawings, coming out and visiting the site to determine, well, how do things look? Where are you compliance-wise with each of those systems and the requirements, and what do you need to do in order to be in compliance and be prepared and budget properly for compliance? And then similarly, we'd recommend determining your background groundwater quality and your source water and your effluent prior to land application. So the state is going to want us to compare your background groundwater quality to your effluent to show that you're not degrading groundwater quality. So the more data that we have ahead of submittal of the enrollment application, the better off you'll be in terms of just kind of anticipating what the state is going to do. So here's a snapshot of initial data collection recommendations. And like I said before, installing a flow meter is ideal. We can help you identify where. Sampling your source water. You know, most of you are on probably wells. You might be on city water. If you're on city water, that's public information as far as water quality. We can access that information, or if some of the constituents aren't available, you can test for that. Testing your winery effluent, what is going to your pond system, and then effluent before it goes to disposal to land application or subsurface disposal. So I would recommend contacting us directly for site-specific water quality sampling. This is just a snapshot of general sampling recommendations. So take a screenshot or reach out to us directly and we can give you more specific suggestions. Monitoring wells are another big component because the state is asking for us to speak to the groundwater quality, and we can't do that if we don't have monitoring wells. So most facilities likely don't have monitoring wells, and so there's going to be a portion of compliance that requires installation of these wells. And so how many are where? That's going to drive, you know, or help you understand what the costs are. How many and where is going to be dependent on the type of system you have, how big it is, what the topography is like. So again, reach out to us with specific questions and we can look at your site and the layout and give recommendations on how we think the state will interpret the monitoring well requirement. And if you'll need 2, 3, 4, we can look up what the theoretical depth of groundwater is if there isn't geotechnical information, to better understand and give you estimates on what the cost to install these wells will be. When I need to do it, or when do I need to do it? So that is the big question for a lot of people. So if you're an existing winery, you don't have any waste discharge requirements or any existing permits through the county or state for discharge of your wastewater, you need to submit an NOI and technical report by January 20th, 2024. And then your technical report must address how you're going to comply with this general order within 5 years of the state issuing the notice of applicability. If you're a facility that has an existing WDR or a conditional waiver, or a permit through Napa County, or something, a local permit through an MOU, you need to submit your NOI and technical report by expiration of that existing WDR. If you have a permit through an MOU, that's a little ambiguous because you're renewing that permit annually. So I don't know if the state has clearly defined, does that permit expire annually, or how are they going to interpret that? I think that they have a lot of people they need to get enrolled before they come after the people that have those annual permits. But just letting you know that the requirement for enrollment of facilities, specifically in Napa, is a little bit ambiguous. And kind of going on a segue, per Kim Withrow, the state and Napa County are still working out their MOU. The state has issued a draft MOU to Napa County. They provided comments and now they're waiting for the state to come back to them. So the Napa County still has the intent of being the local jurisdiction or providing oversight for implementing the general order. And so they're going down that path, but as most things within the state, it's just taking a while. So Kim also said that along with the MOU, they're waiting for the implementation plan from the state so that they can implement they can consistently implement the requirements of the general order. They want to make sure that they have that plan before they are the local authority. Yes, so facilities that have existing permits, your technical report must address a compliance schedule within 5 years of the state issuing the notice of applicability. For a new winery facility, you need to submit an application and a technical report 180 days before operation. Based on my experience with how long it takes the state to get back to people, I would do that well in advance of the 180 days, a year or more if you have a new facility. And then pond capacity and lining timelines for tiers 3 and 4 facilities. So within 1 year of the NOA, you need to prove capacity and permeability. And then within 5 years, you need to meet those lining requirements. Monitoring well schedule. So Tier 4 facilities will be required to do groundwater monitoring. It may be required for Tier 3. So within 180 days of issuance, you'll need to prepare a monitoring well installation work plan and groundwater sampling plan to demonstrate where you're going to put these wells and how they're going to be constructed and what sampling you will be providing to be in compliance with the general order. Within 180 days of approval, those wells need to be installed and you need to commence groundwater monitoring. And then within 90 days of the well installation, you need to submit a well installation report. Noting that monitoring well sampling is different for ponds, LAA, or SDS systems, and I'll get into that a little bit later too. But all of these things, aside from the well installation, that's something that Summit can assist with. We've prepared these plans before, working in conjunction with a geotech to do the installation or a well driller to do the installation, and or working with a third party to take on the monitoring unless you would like to do that in-house. This is just a snapshot. It could be another one to take a screenshot of. We can send it out to you if you're interested, but it's just a flow chart showing if I'm in this tier, then what does this mean from a monitoring and reporting standpoint? So for example, if you produce between 30,000 gallons and 300,000 gallons of processed wastewater per year, are you required to enroll? Yes, I'm a tier 2. What does that mean? I need to monitor all of these constituents and I need to provide an annual report. And if I have exceedances in FDS or nitrogen, then I may need to do a salt control plan or a nitrogen control plan. And then subsequent kind of requirements for tier 3, tier 4. So again, we can send this out if that would be helpful for you. Okay, salt control plans. So this will be a requirement potentially if you are showing exceedance of FDS, and it applies to land application areas or subsurface disposal systems. So this new general order prohibits water softener regeneration brine from being discharged to your LAA or your SDS. They do, however, allow RO or boiler blowdown backwash to go to the wastewater system because it's not providing additive salts that are then getting into groundwater. As part of the technical report and ongoing monitoring, you'll need to demonstrate that your source water plus your effluent is not adding more than 320 milligrams per liter of FDS to your source water, and you'll have to monitor that 2 times per year. And then if you do have exceedances of FDS, then this may trigger a salt control plan within a year, or you'll need to demonstrate that you're involved in another sustainability program or CV Salts. CV Salts is a program within the Central Valley because of their groundwater and salt and high TDS level situation. So CV Salts would only apply to facilities in the Central Valley. But if there become other sustainability programs in other regions of California, that could be an option. Similarly, nitrogen. So there are nitrogen limits for on the effluent that's sent to land application and subsurface disposal systems for tiers 2, 3, and 4. Your nitrogen levels in an SDS system need to be less than 10 milligrams per liter. And for LAA, you need to be able to demonstrate that if there is a demonstrated impact to groundwater, then you may need to prepare a nitrogen control plan for an LAA. Similarly to salt, if you do have an exceedance, an alternative to the control plan would be participation in a regional salt nutrient management plan. But at the present time, I'm not aware of any of those. Compliance-wise, so these are kind of the steps for compliance. You submit an NOI and a technical report. The state is supposed to respond with 180 days. We'll see once people start applying what that actual response time is. Once the state responds and hopefully issues their notice of applicability in response to the application, they'll provide the tier determination, they'll provide the monitoring reporting plan or program, and then they'll provide an approval on your timeline for compliance. After receiving the NOA, there's a variety of things that need to happen within a certain duration, which we've noted here. And we can work with each facility to help provide guidance on what's your checklist of items you need to do after you've received your NOA. For example, within 180 days, you need to have, for tiers 3 and 4, you need to have a spill prevention plan. You need to submit your monitoring well installation work plan. And then there's requirements, every year or so past that point. Again, specifics to each facility, and we can work with you based on your tier to understand what the checklist of compliance looks like. Monitoring requirements. So we created this handy dandy matrix of monitoring requirements, and it really helped me at least simplify what the monitoring requirements would be depending on the size of the facility, the type of system, and what constituent we're monitoring. And this is something we can also send out to you. But just this is one little piece of it. It's like on an 11 by 17 sheet at full scale. And so for monitoring, first, this column is where am I monitoring? Is it my source water, my winery effluent, my pond, my LAA, what have you? What is the requirement and what constituent am I monitoring? FDS, flow, DO, pH. How frequently do I need to monitor that constituent? Monthly, annually, biannually? And what's the method? Is it just a calculation? Is it a grab sample? Is it a composite sample? Quick note, grab versus composite. If a facility can take a grab sample, if it's allowed, which I'll get into, then that's just an easy grab sample out of your pond from your, on the effluent side prior to land application or SDS. For facilities that need to provide composite samples, in many cases, we've suggested investing in a composite sampler. ISCO makes them and there are other brands, but that way it's a calibrated sampler that takes a smaller portion of a sample at intervals throughout the day to create a representative composite sample for the day or whatever the duration needs to be. And then here, this column over here, if you can see my mouse, is broken up into tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the type of system that you have. So for a tier 1 land application area, wherever an X is, that's what you need to sample. And this is the location you would need to sample it at. In general, monitoring and reporting. So for groundwater monitoring, if you are requesting an exemption to, your tier 3 or tier 4, and you want to request an exemption because you can demonstrate you're not degrading groundwater quality, you need to include that request in your application. Overall reporting. So if there's an exceedance of some kind, you'll have compliance letters. Otherwise, you'll have semi-annual reports for tier 4 and only annual reports for tiers 1 through 4. How much will it cost? I think everybody is interested in how much this will cost because it's pretty substantial in a lot of cases for facilities. So the costs include capital improvements. What are you going to need to do to improve your system to be compliant? Monitoring well installation if that's needed. We can help put together estimates for all of the capital improvements, including groundwater sampling preparation. And the reason we included the groundwater sampling in a capital improvement is because it's an investment ahead of the O&M side. It's getting a handle on what your water quality looks like. And so that's an investment in capital in terms of getting a handle on what your water quality looks like. And then of course, there's the operation and maintenance costs. So what are the costs going to be for your facility to do all of this monitoring and sampling, and then the reporting? Noting that in future slides, I'm going to give a couple of case studies and examples, but those case studies on the O&M side do not include the cost of labor to operate or maintain a system. It's strictly related to compliance with the general order in terms of monitoring and reporting. But it is a consideration, for putting in, a package system or a pond, there are O&M labor costs that will need to be taken into consideration because they can be more substantial if you don't have somebody in-house that can do that. So here's the first example. We have a facility that has an existing subsurface system. They're a tier 3 facility producing 100,000 gallons of wine, equivalent to about 600,000 gallons of processed waste. Their daily flow is 2,500 gallons per day. Again, an existing SDS system. So the system improvements that they would need would include a pretreatment system, and this could be one of many things. We've given a few examples here. They'd need to expand their SDS system. This might not be the case for all, but in going through the hydraulic calculations, we discovered that they would need to expand their system. There's the installation of flow meters and then the monitoring well installation. And then there's the O&M monitoring and reporting associated costs. So this is a table showing what all of those costs might be. I want to note that for this one, there's a huge range for the pretreatment units. In this case, we looked at an Advantex AX Max. It's a textile filter for pretreatment. And depending on the loading for the pretreatment system, there's a huge variance in what that pretreatment cost might be. And so the cumulative cost to improve the system to be in compliance is, $666,000 to almost $1.5 million. It's quite substantial. And then there's the potential cost for all these additional plans that we've noted on the right over here. For a facility that has a pretreatment system like this, we've calculated and estimated what the monitoring and reporting costs would be. And again, it's substantial, $25,000 to $33,000. So one thing to note that I had mentioned previously is if you're providing a pretreatment system just to go into a subsurface disposal system, it might make sense to use it for surface irrigation and have a beneficial reuse rather than put it subsurface and have an area that, people often don't like their leach field systems in the vineyards. And so perhaps you can get away from that type of a system. Here's a second example. So a facility has an existing pond, they're tier 4, they produce 1.26 million gallons of wine. They're bottling juice on site. They have a generation of 3.5 to almost 5 million gallons. There's a typo of PW per year, and their daily flow is 40,000 gallons per day. This facility has 4 ponds that have a total of 11 million gallons of pond capacity, and they have a pretreatment system already. So in looking at this facility as an example, they would need to do liner hydraulic conductivity testing for their 4 ponds, likely replace their pond liners, and then do the monitoring well installation around their ponds and in their land application area. And then there's the O&M costs associated with monitoring and reporting. So here's the breakdown of potential costs. So to put in the pond monitoring equipment, do the conductivity testing and install the groundwater wells, we've estimated $350,000-ish dollars for that investment, with the potential of $1.5 million to replace the pond liner. And that includes desludging the ponds, grading prep for the ponds, lining the ponds. So if those ponds do not pass the hydraulic conductivity testing, there's a huge capital investment. And then the O&M costs are a bit more substantial. They're tier 4. And so we've estimated it's about $76,000 to $200,000 and almost $20,000 per year. Annual state fees. Since the last webinar, the state has published the fees for the winery general order, and it is based on the volume of wastewater generated. So you'll see here that it ranges, depending on your annual wastewater generation, ranges from $750 up to $19,000 again per year. And with that, I'm done hearing myself. So I will turn it over to Jason to start the Q&A. And again, feel free to, if you haven't already, to enter questions into the chat room, raise your hand and you can ask the question and we will do our best to answer.
All right, thanks everyone. We had a couple questions come in during the presentation, so I'm just going to start reading those off. Like Gina said, if you have anything else that comes up, feel free to email me, send something in chat, or you can just raise your hand through Zoom and we can bring you in if we need a little bit more back and forth to answer it. So first question that came in is whether or not the general order addresses any reuse requirements.
So the general order does not specifically address reuse requirements. They, of course, allow it. They're more concerned with where you're putting the water, what the water quality is, and that you're not degrading groundwater quality. So if you have the intent to reuse for irrigation, I think the motivation will come more so from just more corporate internal drive rather than a state requirement for reuse.
Okay, next question is about tier 4 facilities and specifically wineries that actually go above that upper limit of 15 million gallons per year and do not have a site-specific WDR. And the question is whether or not the state has provided any guidance as to how those will be managed.
That's a good question. So yeah, there are a lot of facilities that meet that criteria. So if you're over that 15, then you will apply for an individual waste discharge requirement by submitting a report of waste discharge. I have a feeling that the state will implement a lot of the similar requirements in terms of compliance and monitoring reporting, but when you are submitting for an individual WDR, it gives them the leniency to add more restrictive requirements or just additional conditions for your permit. But that's the process anyways. You will apply for an individual permit. And then similarly, that triggered another thought that if a facility has an existing pond or even a package system, but they're discharging to a municipality and they're not discharging from that system to land, then you do not need to enroll under this general order. You will just have an industrial discharge permit with that municipality, and you will not need to show compliance of your pond or package system with the state.
Okay. Next question is there a formal implementation schedule for each region?
Another good question. I don't know that there is, but there should be. I think all things, they're kind of shooting by the hip a little bit. They're going to go after the people that they know aren't permitted first. I heard from Kim Withrow just today, actually, that the state is supposed to be issuing the first letters to facilities. I don't know exactly. I'm sure that they have some people already on their radar. There might be others that aren't on their radar yet, but whatever their list includes, they're sending out the first letters within the next month. So we should be seeing something statewide. It's coming from the State Water Resources Control Board versus Regional Board within the next month.
Okay, this is another one that just came in. Are any wineries grandfathered, for example, if they were built before 1990?
So they do have some leniency in terms of existing facilities, but it's not based on when it was built necessarily. It's based on what tier do you fall into. So like for tiers 1 and 2, there's a lot more leniency. If you're in a tier 3 or tier 4, they're going to require compliance. They have some leniency for the subsurface disposal systems if you have a commingled system, but they're still going to enforce some of the requirements of the general order.
Next question is, how far out from ponds will monitoring wells need to be installed? For example, will they need to be in the middle of the rows of vines?
Potentially, yes. I think that, again, it's going to depend on topography and groundwater gradients, but in some cases they'll want, they need to be downslope of the pond so that you're capturing groundwater in the immediate vicinity of the pond. So if a vineyard happens to be abutting a pond, then a monitoring well very well might need to be in a vineyard or in between a vineyard row. If groundwater levels are shallower, that well might not be that obtrusive, but the depth of the well will depend on where that groundwater level is.
This is one that was covered in the presentation a little bit, but probably worth revisiting because I think everybody's interested in the answer. And the question is, when do the facilities have to be compliant by?
So in general, facilities need to enroll by January 2024 unless you have an existing permit that doesn't expire by then. And then within 5 years, you need to have improvements implemented. And as part of the application to the state, the NOI and the technical report will speak to that compliance schedule. That is, once the NOA is issued, within 5 years, here's how you will be able to demonstrate compliance. So it used to be up to 8 years. Now we're at up to 7 years. But again, there might be some reductions in that timeline depending on the facility and the timing of your current permit expiration.
This is a follow-up question on one that was just asked about the first round of letters coming out. And the question is, if the state issues a letter within the next month to one of our existing unpermitted facilities, how long do we have until we have to file an NOI?
You have until January 21st, 2024. The only reason I could see the state potentially expediting that is if they know that a facility is blatantly degrading groundwater quality and there's some urgency around it. But from what I've experienced, even if you might be in that situation, the state wants to work with you, and they aren't, from what I'm seeing, they aren't requiring facilities to fix things right away. They just want to know that there's a plan in place to do so.
Okay. There's a question about whether or not the general order applies to non-alcoholic juice plants or concentrate plants or any other food and beverage industries other than wineries.
So this is specific to wineries. So if you fall under a different category or distillery, tomato processing, some other food or beverage, that would require either another specific or enrollment in another specific general order, like the North Coast, they have the food and beverage general order. You could fall under that category, or you might need to apply for an individual waste discharge permit. But this order is specifically targeted toward the production of wine.
All right. Next question is, what are the pond liner requirements in regards to type of material and thickness?
So yeah, it's a 2-foot thickness, 1 × 10⁻⁷ centimeters per second. Get that right? That's for a clay. That's for all liners. Yeah, the thickness is for the clay, the 2 feet of thickness. Other alternatives are concrete or synthetic, and we have specific specifications around synthetic liners that we can share with people as well. So there are options, long story short, but they all need to meet that permeability.
And so on the liner thickness, a synthetic membrane can be 60 mil HDPE or 40 mil synthetic geomembrane. But like Gina said, we have standards that we can go through, facility specific. Here's another follow-up question on ponds, and it's who can perform the permeability testing on a clay-lined pond?
So for that, I would recommend a geotechnical engineer. They can come out and do borings, and depending on the size of your pond, it will determine how many borings they'll need. But yeah, they'll do borings and then do the testing on the permeability to prove compliance or not.
All right. What is the setback requirement for land application areas and stream beds? Does this also apply to seasonal streams?
Let me go back to that slide really fast. It's 50 feet to a well. This is for land application or subsurface disposal systems. Oh, sorry, this is just for land application area. I believe it's the same for subsurface disposal, but I will double check that. 50 feet to water supply well, 50 feet to surface waters or water drainage courses. I would assume that applies to drainage channels, just ditches as well. And then 25 feet to property line, unless again, you can demonstrate that you're preventing offsite runoff. Then it can be reduced to 5 feet.
Okay. Will a winery facility with a notice of non-applicability be impacted in the same manner by the general order?
Different general orders. I think a notice of non-applicability is for stormwater. And this is specific to wastewater, winery wastewater. So if you are generating winery wastewater and you are discharging to land, or it's going back into the ground via leach field or other means, then you will need to be compliant with this general order, irrespective of that NONA.
Okay, this question is specific to Sonoma County, but I would imagine other people have similar thoughts. The question is whether Sonoma County has weighed in on whether or not they will allow hold and haul of processed wastewater, thereby allowing the facility to be exempt from the general order.
Good question, and we're still working on it. We're trying to get them to allow it because Napa County allows it, and I think it would make sense for a lot of facilities rather than invest a lot of money in infrastructure just to be compliant. So the short answer is no, but not yet. And we're still trying to get, we've been in contact with Tennis-Wick. I know the Wine Institute's been involved in that discussion. Kendall Jackson's been involved with that discussion with Sonoma County to try to get them to amend some just really antiquated code language.
Okay. Has the state provided any information on the fee reductions available for certified sustainable wineries?
They have not yet. And that's a question that I can follow up on and reach out to Noelle Kramers at the Wine Institute to see if she has any updates. I know that she was also going to spearhead follow up on that.
Okay, this is about the different ways of applying treated wastewater to land. And the question is whether drip application is treated any differently than sprinkler or spray application.
So the same effluent requirements still apply in terms of BOD loading and following good irrigation practices. I know in many jurisdictions spray has not been allowed, but under this order, my understanding is that it will be allowed. You will just need to be able to demonstrate that you'll be able to contain that irrigation and there won't be runoff or ponding. So if you're spraying, you may need to have a tailwater return system unless you can demonstrate that it will infiltrate into the soil without running off.
There's a question about how the general order will impact projects that are currently in progress and whether they'll need to apply and when they'll need to apply.
That's a good question. I think that we are starting to see it for use permit applications as a comment back that we need to be able to demonstrate how the system, whether it's being amended or it's a new system, will be compliant with the general order. And then in terms of building permit applications, we are also seeing comments back from local jurisdictions saying that the facility will need to be compliant with the general order. So I am starting to see it being commented on, and not necessarily you need to be enrolled now, but with the emphasis on you will need to be enrolled, so demonstrate how you will be compliant. So they're starting to ask for more information on how systems will be compliant with the general order. I just haven't seen them require the enrollment yet, since the deadline is technically, January 2024.
There's a question that came in about whether or not facilities need to enroll in the general order if they're not using their treated processed wastewater for irrigation.
So if you're not using it for irrigation, you're not disposing of it on land, or you're not going to subsurface discharge, then you will not need to enroll, but you'll need to show where, well, I should say, really the only way that you're not discharging to land or a subsurface disposal system is that you're sending wastewater to a municipality or you're doing hold and haul. So if you're in either one of those situations, then you will not need to enroll.
This is about any sustainability programs outside of the general order, and are we aware of any that exist that could be used to help meet some of the requirements of the general order?
So this isn't a sustainability, but in regards to salt control, there's a CV salts program. I know that Napa County had talked about trying to get a network of people together to collectively talk about the groundwater monitoring network. I don't know that there's been any traction on that, but my recommendation would be, through the vintners group or the wine growers groups, to get people together, especially if you're tier 4, get people together to create some type of groundwater monitoring network to help alleviate some of the burden of the monitoring that's going to be required. But I don't know of anything that's well established. I've only heard of kind of just talkings about it would be nice to do this.
All right, next question is whether we feel that the general order has changed the outlook for water conservation and wineries at all.
I wish. I think that it's kind of like, it's discouraging beneficial reuse in many ways. So no, it's not really encouraging water conservation, because in a lot of cases, if people are implementing good water conservation practices, their concentration might go up for certain constituents. So I think similarly to water reuse, that any sort of conservation strategies are more of a corporate or just company specific goal. It's a bummer that this order isn't in concert with trying to achieve water conservation goals like the rest of the state.
This is a follow-up question on the tier 4 from 1 to 15 million gallons of processed wastewater per year. And the question is there any possibility that those parameters will change for classifying tier 4 facilities?
I don't think so. They seem to be pretty set on that tier being a limit. I know that they were looking at the potential to change the intermediate tiers, but I haven't heard of any traction on that. So I think that that's pretty well established at this point.
All right, there were some questions that came up when you were talking about the memorandum of understanding with Napa County. And I think you addressed kind of the status of that and where the county is at in terms of coordinating something with the state. But I think it might be worth explaining to everybody just what the purpose of the memo of understanding is between the county and the state.
So for Napa County in particular, their intent is to remain as the authority or the kind of enforcement of what the regulations are for facilities in Napa County, just continuing to do what they're doing now with a different set of requirements. So the memorandum of understanding allows them to have that authority. So they need to have that in place for them to assert jurisdiction. Otherwise, right now, if you were to apply for enrollment, you in your facility in Napa County, it would go straight to the San Francisco Regional Board. You would not be applying to Napa County. So the county wants to maintain oversight of Napa facilities. And so that's why they're going down the MOU path.
Okay, I think we probably got time for one or two more here. We're getting up against 1 o'clock. But another question that came in, since fixed dissolved solids are a measure of all solids, what benefits, if any, are associated with going to potassium-based cleaners from sodium-based?
So for that concentration, switching from like a sodium-based to a potassium-based cleaner, your FDS is not going to vary very much. It's VAR and VER. But the permit does promote the use of potassium-based cleaners with the intent that potassium is actually taken up by plants versus sodium is not taken up as much by plants. So that was really the basis for the permit promoting potassium. It's not really going to affect the FDS concentration that much, unfortunately.
All right, I think we're pretty much up against our time here. As Gina mentioned at the beginning, we're all available to answer any other questions that you guys have. Phone call, email, feel free to reach out to any one of us with questions. We're happy to discuss in more detail and look at facility specific impacts. But appreciate you guys all making the time to do this, and I'll turn it over to Gina to kind of wrap things up.
Thanks, guys. So I know there were a number of questions that you guys submitted when you registered for the webinar that we didn't get to. So I will make a point to respond to those questions. And then, like Jason said, if you have anything additional, please feel free to reach out to me or any one of us, and we will go from there. So thank you very much for joining us today. I know this isn't all great news, but hopefully we can help make the process less painful, or at least help you prepare so that you can budget and plan properly and not have it be so earth shattering to your facility. So everybody take care. And oh, one other plug, Summit does other things besides wastewater. We have planning, civil, structural, electrical. So we can do it all. We can help you with different things. So feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.